the gender fluidity made a lot of sense for me, more than a term like non-binary. Even if I used it as the umbrella term, that I don't belong in one restrictive conceptualization of men or women. But this idea that you're neither man nor woman doesn't really fit for me, because I feel more that I am both, that neither.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you like what we do and want to make a contribution, you can become a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. Now join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman and my pronouns are she and they. In this episode, I have a conversation with LUX, a psychotherapeutic counsellor and French expat who's been living in the UK for over 10 years. LUX's pronouns are he and they, and he is a queer, gender-fluid, polygender, non-conforming man. Find out what that means to LUX in this episode. We also talk about seeing labels as a field, the need for softness as well as radicality and activism, how gender identity is separate from gender expression, the pathologizing of queer identities, not being able to simplify your complexity into a static gender, how gender plurality and sexual fluidity intertwine, and not leaving any part of us out. To clarify some terminology that is used in the episode, AFAB is assigned female at birth. It was recorded on the 22nd of July 2022. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Lux.
Hello, Lux. Thanks for being here. You have given me quite a list of labels, but you've narrowed it down for the podcast title. So I love all that. First of all, what I was going to ask you actually, what is it like for you do you like to try on labels for size, as it were? How do you feel about labels in general? Gender labels.
My perception of labels has changed over the years quite a bit. I think the way I even invite people to consider labels in my work is, if you consider labels as this is this term, it comes with this definition, it comes with those rules, those limitations, then labels can be harmful, because then they are kind of telling you how to be with that identity. But I like to consider labels almost as a meadow, as a field. And like this, you have boundaries within that field. You have the flavor of the field. But what you put in the field, your specific meadow or your specific field has different flowers, different things. So your way of being that label is still very unique. And therefore, labels are very important because they give you a frame of understanding to relate to, and also a frame of understanding to communicate with others. So labels can be, both really fantastic and open a realm of understanding, or completely restricting. And I think early on in my journey around gender revelation and sexuality revelation, I think I use labels probably in a restrictive way. And that probably explained a lot why I kept on bouncing through different labels. And also it took me a long time to discover the label queer, just because that wasn't something used in France. And it probably has changed. I think nowadays people probably use it quite a bit. But for me, it's a best label because in terms of representing that field, it is a field. Queer is less descriptive, but also the most obvious. It's both very precise because we know it gives a clear identity, but that can be trillions of things at the same time. And also it's the best term that represents my gender identity, my gender expression, my sexuality, my activism. I think queer also has a notion of activism compared to people who only identify as lesbian or gays or bisexual without and saying, and when they are very strong in saying, I'm not queer, I'm a lesbian, but I'm not queer. I find that it often comes with a notion of not wanting it to be a big part of their identity. When it is a big part of my identity, it is a big part of my activism, it's a big part of my work, it's a really big part of my life. So queer is the best label. I'm not sure how I've replied to the question. How I change labels, was it the question? Yes. That has been quite a journey because I'm going to focus on gender because my brain went on to thousands of threads around sexuality. Autistic ADHD brain do that. In terms of gender, I think a lot of internalized toxic masculinity and feminism, but self-directed, created a lot of confusion when I realized that I didn't like only men. I thought, okay, I was already told I'm not a real man because I'm too feminine. And if I like men, then I'm even less of a man. Therefore, does it mean I'm a woman? Because again, binary brain at the time, because, society unfortunately conditioned us in a binary way.
Yeah.
And I was like, am I a trans woman? And then it was also the internalized transphobic perception of transness at the time, trans identities. I like to say transness because it's shorter, where I thought, oh, but if I am, then I need to do all the surgery and everything. Obviously, if you're trans, you don't need to do any surgery to be valid. But at the time, I didn't know better. And then I was very attached to certain aspect of my physiology and certain aspect of, I guess, what I attributed to masculinity. And I was like, oh, so I'm not a woman, but for society, I'm not enough of a man. What the fuck does it mean? Am I allowed to swear?
Yes.
I'm French. It's going to come up.
Absolument.
So it was tricky on that aspect. And I think genderqueer was very revealing for me. And later on, in the most recent years, discovering the term of gender fluid made a lot of sense, I think, for me, because my way of relating to being a man-ish and sometimes not at all, but sometimes a bit more woman-ish or sometimes more than one gender at a time. The gender fluidity made a lot of sense for me, more than a term like non-binary. Even if I used it as the umbrella term, that I don't belong in one restrictive conceptualization of men or women. Like when you read the description as a term, and again, it's a description, so use it as a label or as a field.
Yeah.
But this idea that you're neither man nor woman doesn't really fit for me because I feel more that I am both, that neither. So non-binary doesn't really fit when gender fluid express those flows that I have within me. And I discovered very recently, or rediscovered, I guess, the term polygender. And I was like, yeah, that makes more sense. Not as something separate from gender fluid, but more as something combined.
Yeah, can you say
It's
a bit
like
more about what that means to you? Yeah.
What it means to me. I think there are moments where I feel, I guess, fully a man, but not necessarily in how society wants me to be a man. And there are moments where I feel queer man. There are moments where I feel both a man and a woman. There are moments where I feel really, really, I wouldn't say necessarily woman, but almost my gender becomes just feminine rather than woman. And then we can debate but If your
Yeah,
gender becomes
difference
feminine,
between.
what's the difference between
Yeah.
feminine and woman?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot.
Yeah.
Um, but I think sometimes I really feel both. I really feel the man, I really feel the queerness. And by queerness, something that is beyond. And I guess for that, fairly xeno on that. And I don't feel I have necessarily one gender all the time. I
Mm.
think not something static. So the fluidity plus the idea of polygender as we don't necessarily have one gender. Not everyone has one gender.
Mm.
I think it speaks to me. And
Mm.
but I keep on debating on that because on one hand it makes a lot of sense. On another, I'm like, if we were in a smarter society from a very long time, I think we wouldn't need gender.
Mm.
I think we only have created loads of terms, notably recently around gender, because people were fed up of having trillions of identities defined by two terms.
Mm.
Doesn't work. We are all way more complicated and nuanced than that. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, it's true that for some people, one of those words incarnate enough of who they are. Great for them.
Mm.
But that's not the case for most of us. But if society wasn't so fixated on your sex associated a gender that matches that sex
Mm.
assigned at birth, because
Mm-hmm.
obviously society tells us it's both the same thing, which it
Yeah.
isn't,
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't need actually gender identities. So I'm like,
Mm.
I'm always torn between having more and more labels to redefine the sophistication of my gender, although they all belong within queerness, and queer is,
Mm.
the ultimate term. It's the first term that describes me.
Mm-hmm.
But on another hand, I kind of feel like an exhaustion of having to define myself or to describe myself or to reflect on that,
Mm.
and feeling I'm spending a lot of energy and effort, and so many people do that because of society flaws.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need gender. Gender was only invented because some cishet men wanted to create a domination on women and said, hey, if you have a penis, you can rule the world, wear pants, and just
Mm.
dominate, and you'll have your servant at home that
Mm-hmm.
can't work because those poor creatures and and all that toxic misogynistic nonsense.
Mm.
But without that nonsense, it would be, so much better a world where we just are. And then feminine, masculine aren't really a thing.
Mm.
Man, woman aren't really a thing. I think, I don't know. This world will never exist. So we have to use those terminologies,
Yeah, that's
unfortunately.
true.
Fortunately and unfortunately.
Yeah, that's such a good point, actually. Yeah. Like on our way to like a gender-free society, I guess we'll be. Maybe
Yeah,
maybe
but
it's about adding so many labels until it all explodes or something. I don't know.
yeah, I think that's what we are kind of doing. And
Ah,
recently listening to your podcast around xenogender, and this person, I don't remember their name,
Grayson.
um,
Mm-hmm.
Grayson. It's
Yeah.
such a great name. Should have
Yeah.
remembered. Terrible with names. One thing that I really liked they mentioned at some point, especially when I was on my own, like thinking of, do I agree with what they say and da da da,
Mm-hmm.
is how they are criticized by people for making a mockery of gender,
Mm.
and therefore people who really want to society to recognize that there are more than two genders are not taken seriously.
Mm.
I think, they said in one end, yeah, we are creating a mockery of gender because we want that explosion and that gender free. That's not, I'm paraphrasing, that's not like what they said, but that's the essence of what they said. And I
Mm-hmm.
liked that, and also felt they talk about radical things and the fact that some people were more nuanced in trying to stretch society's perception of gender,
Mm-hmm.
when xenogender activism, if I can call it like that, was really more, no, we're going to create the explosion right away. We're not going to go nuanced. And I quite liked that as well. And I think no matter the type of activism, there's always people within the community that blame other people of the same community for being too strong and therefore being at disservice of the cause.
Mm.
And I think, that is, about race, about feminism, about every time there's a movement, there's always pointing fingers at people for being too radical and being damaging, because we need to be more nuanced in asking for rights, in asking for society to change. We need to be gentle, because poor society can't evolve that fast. And I think it's a detrimental waste of energy, because we need both the softness and the radicality. And if we look at movement in history, and maybe I'm going off topic, and probably because I have thousands of threads in my brain, but this idea that radicality doesn't work, it's not true.
Mm.
It's because of radical people who were combining their strength with the people more nuanced, but who were saying, okay, we're going to let the nuanced people do their nuanced thing because it's important, but we're going to do a more radical thing because it's also essential.
Mm.
That's because of people like that we got more rights and recognition for people of color, for women, for queer people. So completely don't remember where I started with that thread, but
That's okay. No, those are such good
yeah,
points
around the
there. Yeah.
gender-free society, it's an ideal
Yeah.
we can't reach, and we will never reach it because we are not just a present. We always are a history, and the human race will always have lingering effects of that overly binary gendered society that has intoxicated us for God knows how long. And by God, I don't mean God, because I'm
Yeah, I
agnostic.
guess mostly since colonialism, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you reckon? Yeah.
As far as I know, and I read a lot of smart things about that unfortunately I remember the vague things. Colonialism and monotheist religions did a lot of harm on that, because obviously colonialism was very much a cis men thing. So imposing on women all sorts of things was also very important for their toxic privileges. But also monotheist religions did a lot of harm, in different societies and tribes all around the world, in erasing the gender identities that existed. There's so many kind of cultural identities that recognize more than two genders, including two spirits for Native Americans, and actually as well, not only they recognized it, and some have 6 genders, some have more, but they also recognize the value of wisdom of those people who didn't belong in one category of men and one category of women, instead of now society considering as something abstract that doesn't exist, something like abnormal, or to pathologize it. It's quite interesting. We went from some tribes that were honoring it and respecting it and valuing it, to monotheist religions and colonialism making it an abnormality to pathologize and heal and fix.
Yeah.
We know the gender of the gender, the danger. It's interesting. The danger of all sorts of pathologizing queer identities, because it leads to all those conversion therapy
Yep.
harm.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, you've touched a little bit on queer and what that means to you, gender fluid as well. Yeah, I'm curious to go deeper into polygender, if you're okay with that. I know you've spoken about it a little bit. Is there more there? Can we explore that a bit more?
Sure, there's surely a lot there, probably. I think for me, it's not just reflecting that the fact that sometimes I feel I have several genders playing at the same time, kind of overlapping.
Hmm.
I'm a man, but also I'm not, but also I'm feminine gendered, and I'm also something else.
Hmm.
And just the fact that even if sometimes I feel only a man, and again, not necessarily how society wants me to be, but
Mm.
thankfully I'm not that. If we take the wide range of my gender experience, there are several genders
Hmm.
and definitely several gender experiences. So the idea that of polygender, that yes, I don't have always one gender, makes a lot of sense for me, and I think make a lot of sense as well for my gender expression, where sometimes I want to express a lot like I feel very feminine and almost woman like, and I want that to really like shine in kind of stereotypically considered feminine elements. But sometimes I feel the feminine, but I want to dress in a masculine way while being my feminine self, and vice versa. Sometimes, I like to be queer, very very non-man, but in a man outfit, or to feel very man. Actually, some days I like as well. I feel very manly and all of that, but I like to feel manly with makeup and attributes that are wrongly considered feminine. Because,
Mm.
as a reminder for anyone, accessories and clothing and makeup and all of that don't have a gender and are just
Yeah.
inventions.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, the poliness of it all represents so much of the diversity of my experience. And I think it's by chatting with so many people around gender, because in my life I have so many queer people
Hmm.
of so many different identities and ways to relate to the term trans, to relate to the term non-binary, to relate to over terminology, agender as well, people who
Mm.
are agender but don't consider themselves trans because they consider trans as as another category of gender
Mm.
that relate to a certain gender identity, where for them they're like, yeah, but I just don't relate to gender, so I
Mm.
don't want a term that's going to tell me I relate to gender. I don't relate to gender, so I want a term that says I don't
Mm.
relate to it.
Yeah.
And again, there's also agender people who consider themselves both agender and transgender, because they
Mm.
consider they're transcending anyways the idea of gender by not relating to gender categories.
Hmm.
So everything is valid, but there's such a great diversity that then listening to people who, no matter that diversity, I heard a lot of people through the years of who seem to have had a complex, maybe fluid and poly journey in the terminology they used, but somehow reached a moment in their knowledge of themselves feeling, oh no, now I know for sure. And this is my gender, and that's a gender that is there all the time. I am a woman and trans or cis, or I'm a man and trans or cis, or I'm a non-binary.
Mm.
And I feel I keep on having those moments and keep on changing, because actually I every time I have tried to find that one and only gender, it doesn't work completely. It's still, I think parts of me are left out. And I think
Mm.
when I read the term polygender and connected it to gender fluidity, and and the fact that I keep on saying, yeah, I'm cisgender-ish, I'm man-ish.
Mm-hmm.
I love ish, how 3 letters can change so many things. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I realized actually maybe, this thing that I thought was confusion for many years. And I think society loves to tell you that you're confused if you're not a very simple one thing with simple terms.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a massive difference between being complex and not fitting what is expected of you and being confused. And actually,
Ooh.
I'm not confused just because my gender is not always the same. It's because my gender is not always the same. But
Mm.
there's no confusion. The confusion is because society wants me to, well, first off, because I present mainly as man. I guess society wants me to be a man and behave
Mm.
like men are supposed to be,
In a particular way,
and all
yeah.
that shit.
Mm.
But there's no confusion. It's just some people have one gender, and again, their gender expression can be poly anyway. I think that the term gender fluid and polygenders are also interesting when we talk about gender expression,
Mm-hmm.
even if they're meant to be more focused on gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we all can be fluid and plural in our expression of or gender identity, even if there is one gender. But yeah, it just doesn't fit for me fully. Like it feels there's a main flavor and then a lot of shift and flows, sometimes superposition.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a bit fed up. Yeah, I think I reached a moment of actually I haven't all those years of confusion. Actually, maybe I wasn't confused. I was just trying to simplify myself and put myself in simplifications that don't fit for the complexity of who I am.
Yeah, I find that's such an insightful point though. So what I'm hearing you say is the confusion was more to do with looking at who you're meant to be in society, that being conflicting, but in yourself, like you're not confused, you're just finding and flowing in your identity.
Yeah, and it relates to something I mentioned to you prior to the interview around static, the gender being a static thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you found your gender, and or for some people, they don't reflect on it. And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it was creating internalized confusion because I couldn't find for very long that staticness,
Yeah.
except with the term queer, because the term queer in itself is not static and not hyper defining. So that's
Yeah.
the only term that felt and still feels very liberating
Mm-hmm.
because with queer, whether gender is plural or one, fluid or not fluid, static,
Mm-hmm.
it fits.
Yeah.
So it completely frees from confusion. It completely frees from anything and everything. But
Mm-hmm.
if we go into like the question of, okay, but what kind of queer? What are the other terms within that umbrella that define you? Then yeah, there's no staticness.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's a proper word, but and actually, yeah, it doesn't have to mean that I'm confused. It just means that that's just not my experience of myself.
Mm.
And people like me are not less valid just because my gender identity, my experience of my gender identity
Mm.
isn't static,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But in
Yeah.
a sense, everything is meant to be static if you look at forms and passports, identity papers, everything is supposed to be hyperstatic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, like I almost want just okay, give me on my passport just the letter Q instead of the letter M for queer. Like this,
Mm-hmm.
it will incarnate all the fluidity of who I am, and it will be a better match that the M for men or male, even if a lot of the time it's kind of fitting enough ish.
Yeah, that's so insightful. I like that. So, in a way, also what you're saying about the fluidity, like static versus fluid. So, from what you're saying, I got a sense of there is a fluidity in your journey, in your gender journey, as you discover things about yourself, as you live your life, as you experience things, as you try labels on or come across labels and you think, oh, that fits. So, that's part of it. And there's also maybe day to day gender expression, there's a fluidity in that for you as well. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of fluidity, and I think even if I tried not to talk about sexuality so far, I think I can't, I was about to say we as a general thing, I can't talk about my gender journey without linking to my sexuality journey, because as well, a lot of internalized conditioning about sexuality, created fluctuations and internalized conflicts because of gender and the relation to it. Again, realizing that I like men, and then being told that I couldn't be bisexual because bisexuality in men doesn't exist. And then being told that my bisexuality, omnisexuality was just an expression of internalized homophobia still being there. So I needed to dismantle further my internalized homophobia, and I will then fully embrace being fully gay, because you can only be straight or gay, binary.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and for a while, and within that, gay men can be as well extremely toxic, and I want to say homonormative, with reproducing a lot of the heteronormativity and heterosexism, with this idea of the toxic PIV, the focus on penis and vagina, because such a big thing, and all this myth of virginity. There's no such thing as that in the way it's conceptualized. It's to always put the so-called dominant male as superior, or like to create an aspect of dominance. And it exists in a very sexist way as well within gay men. If you penetrate, you're the manly one. If you're a bottom, you're the feminine one. And even for that, I was like, if you do both, what are you then? and it's like, so am I supposed to be only masculine if I penetrate and feminine if I get penetrated? But that doesn't fit for me either. Like, plus I probably have a very a spirit of contradiction anyway. Like, if you tell me I need to be only this in that category, I will probably not be. But like, I can feel feminine while being a top. I can feel masculine while being a bottom. Like, it doesn't have, all of that is also very gendered in masculine, feminine, in a very toxic way. And by trying to prove I was only gay, but not fitting that toxic perception as well, I kept on not being too fluid and too complex for that mold, because again, like so many binary, you're either masculine or feminine, you're either straight or gay, you're either man or woman, you're either top or bottom. It's like, it's just sex, plus like, can we just stop this big thing? Like, it's just a piece of flesh and over things into another body. Like, it's just body parts inserting. What part inserts in what part shouldn't be like such a big thing in determining dominance and all that kind of nonsense.
Yeah, like have a hierarchy in a way.
Yeah, it's just body parts, just sex. And I think re-embracing in recent years my multisexuality, my omnisexuality, bisexuality, and finally dating queer women or AFABs, because one of my recent partner was non-binary. It kind of reminded me of dynamics I hadn't explored within myself in a while around gender expressive roles when there is a so-called man and a so-called woman. That because I had still flirted here and there with women over the years, which was already a big indicator of bisexuality, but I was just a gay who happens to like flirting with women time to time. Yeah, well, actually, no, more than that.
Yeah.
But I realized some content of how I behave differently and how one thing that I didn't like, with women actually was suddenly if I was with a woman, I was expected to be the protector and more masculine and the penetrative one because sex is penetration and all that kind of heteronormative things. And for a very, very queer person, it's very it's already disgusting anyway, but in the concept, but it fits so completely wrongly, doesn't fit, that it was very difficult. And by being with queer AFABs, assigned female at birth for those who don't know the term, I realized I didn't need to be anything but myself. And sometimes I could have sex with a partner and feel like we were almost like two gay men having sex, except there was one man and one non-binary person. And sometimes I felt we were two lesbians having lesbian sex, and no matter what was going on as well. And it was interesting to be able to feel my gender plurality and all that polygender and gender fluidity within sex in a way that it was so fully welcome. And then I didn't have to behave in a static one gender role type of way. Not that anyone should, even if you have one static gender, fuck the rules. Just
Right.
let's break the rules anyway. But it was
Absolutely.
interesting to feel even more liberated in being able to be with my flows of genders and femininity and masculinity, and it doesn't matter what's happening, those flows are welcome, and it creates a different dynamic at a different point of time. And it was quite liberating on that aspect to feel, okay, no matter the gender genitals of my partner, I can be anything I am. And if I am several things at the same point and during the same sexual intercourse, feeling both male, female, neither, both, like outside of it, everything can be welcome. And I think that's a new layer of liberation for me. That is still an ongoing thing, and I think it will. I realize how when I see straight women, I'm really usually not interested because I feel they would not welcome that queerness. They would facilitate unconsciously behaviors that are very gendered ruled that wouldn't fit my identity. Even on days I feel mostly men or fully men, it's not the heteronormative binary really doesn't fit even on those days.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's a fluidity in your sexuality as well as your gender and your. Yeah, interesting. So you mentioned the term omnisexual. What does that mean to you? Can you describe it a bit more?
So I discovered it a few years ago by a friend. So a few years ago, for the first time, I met people who were describing themselves as pansexual, and I didn't know the term back then. And then a friend that I thought was also either bisexual or pansexual, and all this debate, bi, pan, and it's an important debate, but also people should stop being so aggressive toward one another. a friend said, "Oh, I'm not pansexual because pansexuality is liking all genders but with no gender preference." And I do have a gender preference. I do like all genders, but I do have preferences. So I'm omnisexual. I was like, okay, I don't know that term. And I, interestingly enough, at the time I told them that I was quite jealous, and I was like, oh, I would love to be omnisexual. Um, it's like, how I spent many years telling all my bisexual, pansexual friends that I was like, oh, I wish I could be bisexual like this. I could date and have sex with women. But like, well, if you wish that you could have sex and date people of all genders, chances are you're already that sexuality of liking all genders.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
that was quite good clues,
Uh-huh.
But I was still stuck in feeling I have to perform only gayness, and otherwise it's a sign that I haven't dismantled something. But actually, what I needed to dismantle is internalized biphobia.
Interesting.
That was created by people who were telling me, "Oh, you're still homophobic within yourself if you feel you're attracted to women." Actually, no, you're imposing your biphobia on me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I discovered that term of omnisexual that has, in a sense, can mean exactly the same thing as bisexuals.
Mm-hmm.
Although, again, some bisexual would say I'm attracted to several genders, but not all genders, or not all gender presentation. Bisexual is such an umbrella term with so many things within it.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be the umbrella term for all sexuality that like several genders. I think multisexual is a better terminology,
Mm-hmm.
just because why bisexual should be both a term that identifies something and the umbrella term for everything else. Actually, multisexual is the umbrella term, and bisexual is on the same level as pan, omni, and polysexual. But yeah, for me, it means, although I do love the colors of the pansexual flag more than the omnisexual one, I think in terms of color coordination, I would prefer to be pansexual. The colors are prettier.
Yeah.
Um, I just can't identify with being pan because although I do love all genders, I do have preferences.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there sometimes the fluidity in those preferences. I
Mm-hmm.
guess fluidity is definitely a constant factor about who I am and beyond gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
The omnisexual made a lot of sense. And the fact that I kept on being so hyper focused on that term, when I discovered it, I was like, oh my God, that's such a great term. I wish I could be that. That would be my ideal of what I would want to be. And it's like, yeah, maybe because it resonates really well of who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But most of
Mm-hmm.
the time I use the term bi just because a lot of people don't know the term omnisexual, like
Mm-hmm.
I didn't.
Yeah.
And I often don't necessarily feel the energy or willingness to explain terminology to people, when bi is a quick way of saying, hey, yes, I'm queer, but I don't only date men.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's good enough.
Yeah.
I
Mm-hmm.
I freed myself enough from those labels that if people misconceptualize my identity because of one term I use and their perception of that term belongs to them, I'll still be myself. I'll still date and have sex with the same way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's for them to deal with their misconceptions. I don't, I will take time sometimes to educate people, but most of the
Mm-hmm.
time I'm just like, okay, yeah, that's just who I am.
Yeah.
Leave me alone with it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Wow. This is so interesting. I feel like I could talk for ages with you and like get more, information about all the delightful labels. I'm just thinking, is there anything you would like to add before we wrap up that we haven't talked about yet, maybe?
I thought of something before we started. I was like, okay, I'd like to talk about that as well. and typical ADHD brain. I was like, I'm going to remember. I don't need to write it down. No, I don't remember.
Yeah.
I think one element we won't have time to cover, but that I'm always very interested in is those categories of gender, those umbrella terms.
Mm-hmm.
I think seeing them as different boxes doesn't work. There's so many different overlaps between the transgender, agender, because agender can be completely different from trans, but can be also within trans. Non-binary can be within trans or not. Gender fluidity is often put within the non-binary label, but as someone who identify with gender fluid but not with non-binary, doesn't work. I have used non-binary in the sense of I state to the world that indeed the binary doesn't fit and doesn't exist. That's the only way I use it, but not, I'm neither of those. And there's a term metagender as well, where people, because there was this interesting thing recently, and I think that's where maybe you saw my definition of myself. I don't know. There was pictures I shared one day, and I didn't realize on the group it was a neurodivergent group called Neurodivergent, but Make It Fashion, which is really fun and very supportive network. I shared something, just a look I had done, and then I was like, oh, I apologize. I'm going to delete the post because I didn't realize it was trans day only on posting. And people were like, but you just said you're gender fluid and polygender and you use he, they pronouns. Therefore, you are part of the trans umbrella. So you're allowed to post. And I was like, okay, thank you for the consideration and generosity, but I do not identify as trans. And I do feel as well that although cisgender I'm cis-ish, again, I think polygender would be a better fit than that binary as well. Are you cisgender or are you transgender? Well,
No.
neither. No, the answer is no.
Yeah.
And I said to them, like, as someone who's not trans, but who wants to be a good trans ally, I wouldn't feel a good trans ally if I was accepting to take space on a trans-only day.
Yeah.
Even if people would perceive that I have a validity in that, I don't think I have a validity in that. Therefore, I want the space to be fully for the people it is for. And I said to them, of course, someone who's gender free and also feel they are trans, they are trans. They are transgender free, and therefore they have a validity in using the space. I am not. So I'm not going to use the space. But yeah, I think we need to stop those categories as well being so rigid and so opposing. Your metagender or gender free. There's so many overlap, and sometimes the term is within or becomes the umbrella term above, and and it shows already that gender is so much more than this very basic simplified line of one line spectrum where there is man on one side, woman on the other, and at middle non-binary. That's not what gender is at all. It's full of knots and different layers and different realm, and it's more a multiverse of madness.
I love that.
Better than the movie, than a simple line of spectrum. I think it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. As I said, I'm sure we could talk for many more hours.
I
We
feel
can
like
all,
I
yeah,
talked at you a lot rather
that's
than
okay.
with you.
Yeah. It's just, yeah, it shows up differently every time. Sometimes I put more in, sometimes I'm more of a listener. Mostly I'm more of a listener, to be honest. I'm comfortable in that role of being a listener. So yeah. But I like the term queer for myself as well. It feels free and expansive, like a lot can live in that space. And I like how you describe the fluidity in it as well. I like that too.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
like your the glimpses of your journey on that I got through your when you do those review after 25
Oh
people.
yeah, the reflections. Yeah.
That's the first thing I listen in your podcast, and how
Mm-hmm.
you were cis, and I love,
Cis-ish. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, cis-ish,
Yeah.
and defining yourself as cis queer. I thought, yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I can replace the ish definitely, or maybe queer cis. Maybe I would put the queer before the cis for
Mm-hmm.
myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if you put cis queer, the cis before the queer for yourself, it works as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I did like that, and I still do like that. Since then I feel like I've simplified it and I just use queer now. But yeah, there is still something about that is, yeah, that feels quite resonant. Like queering the cis, like cis but not quite. Cis-ish, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
sounds already quite plural and variate a
Hmm.
variety of.
Yeah. Yeah, it is such a journey. I mean, I don't know where I'm going to end up with it. Do we ever end up anywhere? Do you know what I mean? It's all a journey, isn't it? Yeah.
But that's why when people keep on, so-called gender critical people, no, you're not gender critical. You're just full of hatred and and
Mm.
trying to tell people how they're supposed to be when they know better. We all know better who we are than some
Mm.
stranger.
Totally.
But the fact that we have created so many terms, the fact that for so many of us, it is a massive journey to figure out who we are,
Hmm.
that's already the proof, the main top proof that gender is not a simple thing. Because if
Mm.
it was a simple thing, then we would be completely fine within a binary model and everyone would be a man or a woman
Mm.
and cool.
Yeah.
So, millions of people questioning and spending a lot of energy within themselves and with the world around that
Hmm.
prove that gender is way, way, way more complex than how society
Definitely.
wants it to be.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Lux.
Thank you for giving me some space. Hopefully, I'll have been cohesive.
What's that?
Hopefully, everything I said was cohesive and
Yes,
well
yeah.
articulated, but I'll see
Yeah,
when
really
I listen to
insightful.
it.
Like, yeah, like I feel like it always takes me a while to process the things that I said, but I'm like, oh, I love like the light bulbs going up all over the place. It's really good. Yeah. You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Lux, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Lux on their website, lucasvoclere.com, and on Instagram and Twitter at Purposeful Self. Links are on the episode page. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media, and on YouTube. Again, if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender or buy us a coffee. Links are on the website. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open minded. Are you happy to get started? Do you have any
Yeah, we
questions?
can try. Just a bit apprehensive. I'm aware. I was like, what? Why am I doing this again?
Oh,
And
yeah.
do
Yeah.
I feel I can talk about my gender properly? And also, it's gonna be my gender is not that static, but the recording will be. and
That is such a good point, though.
and
Yeah.
it's like I'd done this podcast, so this video podcast on Instagram like a few
Mm-hmm.
years ago about my bisexual coming out journey.
Mm-hmm.
But at least it was the main core of it was reading something I had written for myself that then I used for that, and then chat about that. But
Mm-hmm.
it was very already articulated and well, kind of well written, and I had reviewed what I had written, and if I
Mm-hmm.
was,
Yeah.
although now, it would be interesting 2 years later to read it again and see,
Yeah.
what
See
I think
that.
about it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And yeah, that's the thing, because it can be really, it can evolve. And then some people are like, wow, that is so not me anymore. I've just
Yeah,
moved
and
on.
I think my perception of gender terminology, gender identities, and all those conversations keep on evolving, changing, and there are days where I'm like, do I really think this? Do I really think that? I don't know. You
Yeah.
know, it's like, it's
Yeah.
interesting. So I'm like, am I gonna say stupid things? And then be, oh shit, I'm a queer therapist and I just said really stupid things, and now queer people will listen to that, and oh, my entire reputation and credibility will be ruined.